Hello, this is Cryptolyze. I hope you are well. This Sunday, 19 November 2023, we have a somewhat special video. For this Sunday, we are going to talk about RWA, real-world asset. So as usual, we have already discussed this system, this explanation, what tokenization is. But this time, we're really going to go into detail. 1, about what it is. 2, the different protocols to monitor. And 3, where can we easily find the information? I'll explain everything to you, and it starts now. As a reminder, you always have the possibility of having free access to the educational course, which is a 60-hour training course worth €400, which allows you to learn blockchain, crypto, investment, technical analysis, trading, everything to become profitable. Through 130 videos, 400 pages of guides, quizzes to find out where you are in your progress, and all for free. To have access to this lifelong training, simply use the platform of one of our partners. Everything is explained in the comments and descriptions. So when we talk about RWA, clearly we are talking about the next narrative for the next bull run. For the bull run which may be starting now. But what you need to understand is that behind the notion of RWA is the notion of tokenization. The very principle of the blockchain is to be able to create something digital which is unduplicable and which serves as a basis for tokenizing something from the real world. And this is the notion of RWA, real-world asset. It's the act of taking something that is real, such as, for example, part of a house, part of an apartment, to make a token that represents this object. So on this, it is a narrative which will be very present, and which is already very, very present, even in the different public places or in the different big institutional players, because it is something that we really need to have the possibility of, to have a digital asset which has an underlying, which is going to be something real. The complexity, on the other hand, of this RWA will go through the real compliance phase. Let me explain. The fact of passing from something digital, which basically has always been fungible, implying something which could be duplicated, to something which is non-fungible and which is decisive for the proof of ownership of the object in the real world in question. And that's something that can be relatively complicated. For example, in Europe, you just have to see something that is happening. It is Richard Détente in particular, the person who is behind the Grand Angle channel, whether it is Grand Angle Echo, whether it is Grand Angle Crypto, who along with his associates launched CleanSat Mining, which is something that tokenizes a company that owns and operates miners of Bitcoin. And just to do this part, there was a lot of compliance, a lot of work with Swiss law, because Swiss law allows it under certain conditions, but not all countries have it. Case, and even see, there are quite few countries which allow it. We have as a second example Real IT, which I have already spoken to you about, which is the possibility of tokenizing a building, an apartment, something like that, in order to be able to buy it. The concept behind it is to have, for example, bought a house together, and to be able to redistribute the cost of the allocation to the different owners, to the different holders of the token of that house, to be able to recover it. It's something that already exists, but the idea is to go much further in traditional finance, where it is now obligatory to go into a notion of scaling, a notion of wanting reduced costs. And it's true that tokenization, the fact of being able to tokenize real assets, greatly facilitates the transaction between different third parties. That implies that I sell you a crypto or I transfer you a crypto. That implies that this crypto, if ever there is an underlying asset, which is, for example, a building, or why not a good American treasury, you become the new holder of this underlying asset. And that's something that's huge. Imagine the complexity when you buy or sell a house. You have to go before a notary. There are fees. It's long. It's something that is complicated, that is cumbersome, in which there are registration fees, there are tax fees, and all this can be automated thanks in particular to the notion of tokenization. So tokenization, in fact, is not a functional brick that allows you to do that. It is really the use of the blockchain, strictly speaking, for a use case in its own right. All this to say that tokenization is clearly something that will be a narrative in the future, perhaps not only in this bull run, but in other bull runs to come. And it is really one of the most important use cases of the blockchain because we can tokenize absolutely everything. So, where can we get this notion of RWA? So there is already a site that you should know. I think you certainly already know it if you were interested, RWA, XYZ, in which you have several pieces of information. So there is not all the information. It is in any case some of the information on the different protocols which do tokenization. Whether it is private credit, we will explain, whether it is US bound or whether it is the listing. In fact, of all the cryptos which are linked to the RWA. Afterwards, we will have real estate and stablecoin which will arrive subsequently. We will explain why. But what is important is that each of the protocols will already have a specialty and a type of tokenization which will be particular. Afterwards, is there any point in owning the token of this protocol? That's up to you to determine. You will see that it is mainly cryptos which are used for governance to pay fees or for incentives. But in all cases with, as usual, the FOMO part and the purely speculative part, there is a good chance that we will have a general valuation of the multitude of tokens that I am going to present to you. So, already at the level of this site, private credit, you have to understand that these are all protocols which offer here credit requests from private entities in which I can actually lend to these people, and I will have an API in function of that. We will have Centrifuge and Maple, which are the best known. Maple, if you don't know it, I've already talked to you about it several times. Given that it is the protocol that is used by many CFIs, therefore centralized finance, but which uses the decentralization of finance to make a centralized offering, which used Maple to actually be able to have returns on stablecoin. And we have Centrifuge, which does almost the same thing with a little difference in the sense that we will have a slightly more advanced form of tokenization, and above all, tools to be able to offer forms of tokenization yourself, of assets. So we're going to start with Centrifuge, which has a token called CFG. We're going to pay a little attention to this token because we don't yet have all the supply that is in circulation. We have a market cap, which is relatively low in dilution. Obviously, we will only talk about a very important diluted market cap, because you will see that there are protocols which have quite little dilution, or in any case, which are quite little diluted currently in the case where we have a lot of tokens that will be issued. And what will be interesting with the CFG in particular is the charter. Clearly at the moment we have just broken an accumulation zone, which is a ranging zone which had started in May 2022, and in which we have finally made the break. And here we have made a nice pullback in which we had a first acceleration. It is not yet validated the pullback. But we are really not far from me. The second level that we could have is here the 0.36, for here a retest before leaving again, which is the zone in terms of acceleration. We can see that here we have a first break, retest, second break, retest. So either we leave directly or we go do a retest here. But we are in any case in an interesting zone to expose ourselves if this asset interests us. Namely that centrifugal behind it is really the principle of having access to credit. So this is something that we already know. We have credit connection platforms. But this goes much further in the sense that we will have each of the applicants in which we will have specific offers. We must understand that on the other hand, on each of these offers, we will have particular ideas, different schematics, or even what is said to be different. It also implies that there are risks that are inherent to everyone. Loans, and that you must always be very careful. We are not immune to a default, and we do not necessarily have over-collateralization as we can find with other players. So we are no longer in a pair-to-pair form to provide people who are ready to lend. People who need money. But therefore we can have fault management, and therefore we must always be very careful, and that is also valid for Maple for these two typologies. Because what we tokenize here is the implied connection between the person who is ready to take risk and the person who is ready to offer a return for this risk. Always be careful and take a step back from where you systematically place your funds to clearly see the risks associated with this site, in which we have Maple, which technically is still relatively clean. We are going to look for targets which are rather classic, because right now we are in a dynamic where we have a small market cap, so we can already look for a market cap which could tickle the 2, 3, 4 billion in the middle of a bull run, which already presents some pretty crazy targets. When we look a little at the targets that would represent, it would be on Onyx Tanks 15, already on the current state of the course, for those who have accumulated during this whole phase and who have a PMA below from 23. We would already be on X20. So you always have to be very careful, because that implies that we will have a profit taking that will be quite strong around 1.6, 1.7 at the CFG level. Then we have another protocol, I spoke to you about it, it's Maple. Maple, who also actually made a first explosion. We had the same principle, a phase of accumulation of rank on bear market in December 2022, where we had something which ranked excessively during 2023, while the rest of the cryptos were in the process of push. And there, we have a phase of bullish acceleration which is taking place. But if we look, in fact, we are more in a form of ranging, which is much higher, between $24 and generally $3. So we have already made a very big progress compared to the lowest point that was made, so we will have to pay just a little more attention to the level of Maple, especially since we are in the same type of product. We are sure a product which aims to offer you at the application level. Directly, we're going to do it on Ethereum so that it is simpler. But the possibility of being able to expose yourself to requests closely, in which we have a cash management which brings together a little bit of everything, and in particular good treasures that we find here, and we will have here, for example, direct maples, therefore which is the provision of certain cryptos, or in any case cash for certain assets. But we are in products which are structured, therefore we are always very, very careful. In which we also have time limits to be able to recover, we see the liquidity between 7 and 14 days, liquidity between 24 and 48 hours. So we have the necessary time to be able to withdraw these funds, so we are always very careful. And Maple the same, we have good prospects on that. But Maple, we are only at 44% of emissions, okay? And we are on a diluted market cap of 148 million. So the same we could easily get 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, even 5 billion if ever it is a big narrative or a small narrative, which in any case takes effect on the MPL, so we could seek much higher targets. Because when we look a little bit at the notion of seeking a market cap at 1.5 billion, it is at 60 years that we do 1x10. So we could have an MPL at more than $150 for an evolution thereafter. You just have to be careful. We will have massive profit taking when we arrive in areas, for example. 68 minus $70 with a retest of the 88th. Here, if we don't actually count the locks that have been fully redeemed, at this point it is completely logical to have these possibilities. Speaking of tokenization, we obviously also have Trax, for example, which is a tokenization tool, given that it is an ETF. So it is behind a tokenization of cryptos, which are grouped together in a crypto basket to be able to be exposed to it. It's the same principle, which means that, for example, as I presented to you last time, I created an index which represents the top 50 of cryptos, and therefore that means that there we have the majority of the big ones. Cryptos which are in the top 50, in which we have an exposure on it, and it is a token which represents all of these cryptos which will evolve according to these cryptos, and therefore it allows us to have a real representation of what is happening, and that allows to have exposure to that. And the same is an example of tokenization that you can find, and which totally fits into the notion of RWA. Besides, we have other protocols, and when we look at the RWA and we go to the US bounds part, therefore, which are in fact the tokenization of companies which own and issue American token vouchers, be careful, it is not American debt which is tokenized, at least not directly. It is the companies which hold this token voucher which are behind tokenized, okay? These are company shares that are tokenized. And precisely on this, we have certain limits. Here, for example, we have a minimum investment in Hondo, which will be 1 lakh USDC, and we have others which do not have no or almost no minimum, in which, on the other hand, we will be on protocols like Ethereum with fees which are relatively substantial. To take a look at what it looks like, in particular, we will see Hondo, who released USDY, which is in fact yielding linked to the dollar. And in fact, they released a stablecoin which increases little by little, and which in fact includes quite simply its yielding, therefore implying the treasure of the underlying assets which are behind it. So that's why we have a happy way of 5% more than 5%, which are in fact linked to the good treasures which are behind. To be a little more precise, I believe that here we normally have good treasure, which should make 5.33. Here we are at 5.1, because we have 0.23 behind management fees which are implemented, which are the way in which the protocol is remunerated. We have others which will be baked, which allow us to do exactly the same thing, except that it is a little different. We have other types of tokens, and in any case underlyings, which are made available. As we see the treasury bonds from 0 to 1 year, we have the treasury bonds here from 1 to 3 years, and we will have the BH, which will in fact be the receivables of large companies which are made available, and the YTMC is yield to maturity. All right? So we have the possibility of being able to expose ourselves to this. Once again, we pay attention to two things. This is because, one, on this, we do not expose ourselves to the underlying asset itself. We expose ourselves to the company which owns the underlying asset. All right? Very important. Second thing, there is the compliance part, which is not necessarily very clear as it stands, in which is the notion of ownership of tokens recognized. And where is it recognized? And how is it recognized? On this, we do not yet have a legal framework, so we still have a risk framework which is relatively strong, and that is why we have to be a little careful with the notion of RWA. It is under construction, and it is precisely a course of structural modification of the evolution of traditional finance and the way in which traditional finance will evolve. In any case, that is my opinion. In the years future. So behind yet another new crypto in which I am going to present to you the Rio, which is for me also something which is quite interesting on the other hand. Market cap diluted very, very low. We are talking about a dilution which is currently 8% currently, and we are on a market cap of 29 million. Diluted is very, very low. Why? Because we have an accumulation phase which has just ended. We have a rupture phase. We are in a retest phase for me. We can go research a little lower the 0.1. But all in all, we are in a long-term exposure phase to seek out targets which are relatively high. Their IO behind it is Realio, which is a project which aims to directly privatize the notion of real estate, which is a bit of a representation of real IT. Except that reality allows you to privatize, or in any case tokenize, houses. Here we would have an infrastructure which would make it possible to tokenize much more than houses, and which would have the capacity to be able to offer equity, therefore shares, in the form of a token through real estate. Therefore a project which is relatively interesting and which I've been watching for some time now, even though I'm not yet exposed to this project. Next to it we will have the PropPay. So the PropEC is another protocol which is apart, which has a cap mark which is relatively high, relatively high in any case compared to the image they currently have, $157 million with seven offers in circulation. And we have a token which is quite recent with a range which is very similar to OP but with much lower volatility. For me, I think it's still a little bit here given the release of tokens that we risk having, but the project itself is super interesting. It is PropChain which is behind it. It is a blockchain which aims to be able to build the RWA and especially for PropTech. So maybe you don't know about PropTech. It's all the technologies that aim to transform housing currently. Okay. There are lots of new technologies that are being considered around real estate, in which, for example, we could have 3D home printers, in which we have already seen quite a few videos, in which we could have transformations and modernization and digitization of housing. Finally, there are lots of small companies, small startups which are working on this, and it is generally PropChain. That is the goal. They target these startups to be able to tokenize their solutions, or in any case, tokenize their evolution, and that can be interesting. Namely that we have a market cap which is relatively low, 10 million. But be careful, we do not forget that we are looking at the diluted AKM brand, 150 million already if we had the entire release of the token. So we always pay close attention to that in terms of exposure. In any case, we have lots of projects that are likely to happen. We are at the start of the RWA. We are at the start of a potential narrative. At the RWA level, even if the narrative has already started during the previous bull run, and this is where we have to be careful because it may be an underlying narrative which will last for several years, but which will not be a speculative narrative as we experienced during the previous bull run. Are two separate things. They are things in which we can have less very strong speculation during the bull run, but something which will rise little by little with an evolution to be made. In any case, what is certain, what will be complicated to manage, will be the evolution of tokens at the RWA level. Finding the right projects in which it will take time, and that's why, for example, in Trax, there is the possibility of making an ETF. There I made an ETF on the top 50 of cryptos, and I'm going to try to make an ETF precisely on the rather themed RWA to give you the possibility of being able to expose yourself to that quite easily, in which we will systematically update the new ETFs well. In any case, the new cryptos which could enter into the RWA and have something that offers exposure to that narrative. Ideally, I will try to do the same for AI as well, depending on the different limitations that Trax can offer compared to that, and you will find all the information from Trax, in fact, in comments and descriptions. And as soon as that is done, I will give you an update on it, in which I will give you the link, if you are ever interested. To directly expose you to an ETF which is tokenized itself, which precisely represents the assets which manage the tokenization. Inception. We're really not far away. In any case, I hope you liked this video. If so, don't forget to leave me a like and a comment. It always makes me very happy to read and respond to you. And we'll meet again tomorrow at 7 p.m. as usual for the daily news to come back to the crypto news and everything that happened. Spent this weekend and prepare for our week.